But in terms of their theory of value, Marx explicitly said Adam Smith has it right. He not only said that, he said Adam Smith was head and shoulders above all the other political economists of his day in terms of the clarity of his thought and the power of his insights. I want to draw your attention to a few other key terms in the Smith reading that imply another point that Marx is also going to make a great deal about. In the beginning of chapter 6 and again in the beginning of chapter 8 of the readings that I asked you to do from The Wealth of Nations, Smith refers to these two things, the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land. And he suggests that these are the two historical phenomena that are necessary to putting in place this market system that he analyzes. Yeah. What does stock mean? Good question. Let's look at this. In that early and rude state of society which precedes both the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land, in that original state of things which precedes both the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock, the whole produce of labor belongs to labor. Stock here can mean a number of different things. In a sense, it means stock like we think about in the stock exchange. In another sense, it might mean, more generally, by stock is meant the means of production. The tools and machinery and equipment that are necessary to produce things. Now, what he's suggesting is, previously, before the capitalist market, there was not appropriation of land and accumulation of stock. And what he means by that is land was not appropriated as private property by private owners. Land had a more generalized communal or common collective ownership. So appropriation here means taking into private ownership, making into private property of land. Accumulation of stock is also about private ownership, but it has a more elaborate meaning of the accumulation of stock as such by private owners, beyond what is needed for day-to-day simple production. Now this may seem a little arcane, but the simplest way to think about it is the accumulation of stock in a stock market, right? There are people, institutions, corporations that own way more stock than they immediately have any particular use for, or in fact than they use at all. They simply own shares in corporations. They have accumulated stock irrespective of whether they themselves put it to use. Now, I draw your attention to this because Smith is essentially describing the historical conditions on which and from which this market society with this type of value operates and becomes real. And Marx is going to emphasize this as well. If Malthus described everything in terms of natural laws that were supposedly true anywhere and everywhere simply by the nature of the way the world is organized, Smith and Marx are stopping and suggesting, no, there's something different here in the society that we're describing today. And the laws or dynamics that we need to understand this society are not universal laws. They are specific to this form of society and economy. So, we might usefully depict the pre-market, pre-capitalist situation as one in which the laborer and the owner and the landlord were, in a sense, fused together. There was not yet a strict division of labor between all three of these. Now, it's not to say there wasn't any division of labor between some of these, but as Smith suggests, originally the laborer was the owner of whatever the laborer produced. The laborer and the owner were the same. You can also think about the situations in which the landlord, if there's no market in land, if there's no appropriation of land, there is no such thing as a landlord, right? If there is, it might be the village or the clan or the tribe that has de facto control over some amount of land, but they aren't landlords in the sense that we're used to it now. We might envision initially a division of labor in which the owner of stock, the owner of the means of production, becomes a separate person or a separate class from the laborers and the landlords. The picture that Smith is interested in describing is one in which the three roles have separated from each other. You have people who are landlords, who own land. You have other people who are laborers, who work or labor. And you have a third group of people who are the owners of stock, not the owners of land. Or rather, they may own a little piece of land that their factory sits on, but their role in the picture is not one of a landlord, it's one of the owner of a factory. And again, the factory owners are not the people who actually work in the factory. This is the division of labor that, sort of in a broad sectoral sense, Smith is interested in understanding. And he recognizes that this is a historical phenomenon. This has come to be the case. It was not universally true that society was divided into these three classes. Now, these become useful categories for thinking about wages and prices and the value of labor as it manifests in prices in the market, or the value of things. The profits of stock are regulated altogether by the value of the stock employed and are greater or smaller in proportion to the extent of this stock. Somebody who owns stock expects to receive a percentage return on that investment. If they have a bigger investment, they expect bigger returns, 5%, 10%, whatever. Wages, profit, and rent are the three original sources of all revenue as well as of all exchangeable value. All other revenue is ultimately derived from some one or other of these. He says you look at the nominal price of any good, you can analyze it, you can boil it down into a portion that is attributable to the labor that went into producing that good, a portion that's attributable to the rent that a landlord derives from the use of a piece of land, and a portion that are the profits on the stock employed in making that good. Each of the three classes has a certain kind of revenue that accrues to it and is a component part of the price of any good. In a civilized country, labor contributes only part of the exchangeable value of the annual produce. And by civilized, he's essentially saying modern, we're talking about Britain now, okay? The idle, and here he's specifically thinking about landlords and capitalists, people who don't actually do the work of making a good, that nonetheless has exchangeable value, and those people get a part of the price, right? The idle everywhere consume a great part of it, of the exchangeable value of the annual produce. And according to the different proportions in which it is annually divided between those two different orders of people, its ordinary or average value must either annually increase or diminish or continue the same from one year to another. In other words, depending where these lines are drawn, the portion that each group receives from the exchangeable value of a given good changes. And he's interested in thinking about where those lines get drawn and why. So he suggests that there is a natural and a market price for each of these kinds of revenue, or a natural or market level. The natural is the ordinary or average rate of wages, profits, and rent. The market price is the actual price at a given moment. So we might say the price of plywood when there's a hurricane approaching is abnormal, but it's still the market price. It's deviating from what is the sort of standard, normal, or average distribution of exchangeable value. But it is still the market price. Market prices, he says, may be higher, lower, or the same as natural prices depending on circumstances. So again, we see a potential decoupling between price and value. Yeah. The question is, how does it differ from nominal and real prices? And we're actually going to get to that in a moment. It relates to the fact he's trying to figure out what the natural wage is. And here we have to think about what's the sort of minimum wage that is possible. And in other words, how do we get past just the market price, the nominal price of labor, and ask what the sort of underlying foundational value of that labor is? And what he's going to say is, and this is how are wages set. Though in disputes with their workmen, masters, by which he means employers, must generally have the advantage. There is, however, a certain rate below which it seems impossible to reduce for any considerable time the ordinary wages even of the lowest species of labor. A man must always live by his work, and his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. And here again, this is in the context of the poor laws and the relatively new phenomenon of widespread, unemployed, impoverished people. And the question is, what is the sort of underlying basis on which wages are grounded, so to speak? And he's suggesting that the wage has to be at least enough to keep the person alive. And that can, in different societies, that can mean a lot of different prices, right? We're accustomed to thinking about global poverty in terms of the number of people who survive on $1 a day of wages, right? Of course, in our society right around here, it's hard to imagine how anyone could survive on $1 a day, right? The federal wage, poverty wage in this country is well above $1 a day. Nonetheless, there's some kind of common fundamental underlying reality that has to be expressed, and that is keeping these workers alive. So how are wages set? He says the money price of labor is necessarily regulated by two circumstances. The demand for labor, just to say how many jobs there are out there, how much demand there is from employers for workers will in part affect how much they're willing to pay, and the price of the necessaries and conveniences of life. That is, how much money do these laborers need in order to survive? The demand for men, like that for any other commodity, necessarily regulates the production of men. So, and this may seem odd, he's essentially saying, well, look at what it costs to produce a laborer. And that will give you a sense of what the value of labor is. And therefore, in an indirect way, or in a way that is subject to market vagaries, a sense of what the price of labor is. Labor, in this framework, is just another commodity that's bought and sold like any other, with a price and a value underneath that price that is potentially different from that price. Yeah? Can that be translated into the cost to develop the steel for that labor? Yes. Yes. It does speak to the question of what does it cost to produce that labor in terms of education, for example. Why is a computer programmer paid more than a construction worker? On this argument, it's because it costs more to produce a computer programmer than it does to produce a construction worker. More money goes into training that person to do that job than it does to train the construction worker to do his or her job. So if we contrast Malthus and Smith for a moment, in Malthus's system, population growth outstripping agricultural production creates a redundant population. There are too many people for the amount of food available, which produces misery and vice and checks on population. The checks on population bring down population, or bring down the rate of growth of population, reduce population, which at least potentially, maybe only in the short term, according to the sort of pure reading of Malthus, but at least potentially can allow wages to go back up, in a sense, prosperity to return. Now, Malthus is none too clear about exactly how this works, but to the extent that the check on population has some kind of economic function, it is to restore some kind of balance between population and food, right? The problem with that is that it simply repeats the cycle, and you end up having the same problem again. Hence, the value of not providing food to the poor, because if you do, they're just going to reproduce, and there are going to be more of them, and you're going to be stuck with a worse problem than you started with. And if you did the Engels reading for today, this is the sort of circularity in Malthus's argument that Engels excoriates him for, right? And he says, what this really means is that the world was overpopulated when there was one man on Earth, because the trajectories that Malthus says are universally the case would already apply at that moment in time. You would already be doomed to end up in a state of misery and vice. Smith is attuned to these issues. He says in civilized society, it's only among the inferior ranks of people that the scantiness of subsistence can set limits to the further multiplication of the human species. There are rich people who've got plenty of money and plenty of food and don't have any misery and vice. And then there are the inferior ranks of people who live hand to mouth and experience this scantiness and misery and vice. And it can do so in no other way than by destroying a great part of the children which their fruitful marriages produce. So in Smith, and Smith actually arrives at a very different conclusion about how all these things work, how markets mediate population and wages, right? Population growth causes an increased labor supply, which results in lower wages, right? The supply of labor goes up, so wages go down. Lower wages mean higher profits for the employers who employ those workers at lower wages, which means increased accumulation and investment. Higher profits mean those who own the stock have more money to invest in more stock, to build more factories, for example. And in turn, that increases the demand for labor, which pushes wages back up and allows population growth to continue. And he pictures a kind of, not perfect, but general correlation between the wealth of a nation as embodied in its stock and the population of the nation, which is employed to use that stock to make things like food. Now, Smith can acknowledge or recognizes that at any given point in time, the market price of labor can diverge from its value and can even drop below its natural price. There can be so many unemployed people on the market at the same time that wages drop below what it takes to actually feed yourself. And then, yes, you would get misery. And he therefore has a way of explaining the existence of these people who don't have enough work, and even if they have work, don't have enough money to subsist according to the standards of their society at the time. Nonetheless, that is a sort of self-correcting phenomenon insofar as lower wages should mean higher profits for capital, increased accumulation investment, increased demand for labor, and so on. In other words, far from being a universal tendency of the system of humans and the environment as a whole that tends inexorably towards too many people and not enough food and misery and vice a la Malthus, Smith suggests, no, in fact, this system has got other pieces, other dynamics within it that correct for these potential problems and create the conditions in which, in fact, the misery is alleviated. Excuse me. So for Smith, it's a question of the distribution between these three classes of people of the revenue generated by exchange. And generally speaking, if you can keep them in some kind of relative proportionality to each other, you should have a kind of virtuous cycle. Malthus can't get there because he's convinced that it's only a question of food, and he does not get into these questions of the distribution between these three classes of people, or rather, he doesn't see a way out of the problem in those terms. He's interested in this line between how much investment is going into producing food versus how much investment and social wealth is going into producing other things. And to the extent that he sees any solution, it's that more and more and more social wealth should go into producing food, so that there will be more food, and it will somehow manage, maybe in the short term or in particular localities to keep up with population. Now, Smith's ultimate conclusion about population is this. It is not the actual greatness of national wealth, but its continual increase, which occasions a rise in the wages of labor. He asks at the end of that reading, what's the condition in which you will have general prosperity among the working classes, or the lower tiers of society? He says, it's not a question of the overall wealth of the nation. It's a question of the rate of growth of the wealth of a nation. You can have a nation which as a whole is not very advanced and not very wealthy, but it can still have an absence of poverty or a relative lack of poverty, provided that it is increasing in its overall wealth. Does that make sense? The most decisive mark of the prosperity of any country is therefore the increase of the number of its inhabitants. And here we have Malthus completely upside down, right? Granted, Smith came first and then Malthus. But if you compare them, Malthus seems to have this totally dismal picture in which we're all doomed. Smith actually says, no, the growth in the population of a nation is symptomatic of prosperity, growing prosperity. A country that is getting richer will get, one of the expressions of that wealth will be a growth in the number of its citizens or its people. 5-minute break.